Have you ever wondered what the exact price of human integrity is? Most people believe it has a high value, something that cannot be bought or sold. But after living 65 years on this earth, and spending 30 of them digging through the darkest corners of people's financial lives, I have learned that integrity usually has a very specific price tag. For some, it is a few $1,000s. For others, it is a luxury vacation. In the case of my daughter-in-law, Brittany, it was the price of a custom-cut emerald ring that had sat on my late wife's finger for 4 decades. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the sky hangs low and gray over the suburbs, pressing down on the world like a heavy blanket. I was sitting in my favorite wingback chair in the living room, a cup of black coffee warming my hands. The house was quiet, the only sound being the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window pane. Then, the silence was shattered. Brittany was pacing back and forth across my Persian rug, her movements jerky and impatient. She stopped, turned to face me, and her eyes were hard. She didn't ask, she demanded. She laid out a ridiculous argument about how stagnant assets, like heirloom jewelry, were a waste when they could be used to fund a life-changing experience in the Caribbean. She wanted me to sell my late wife's engagement ring. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry, and I didn't stand up to argue. I simply looked at my watch, checked the time, and then looked back at her. She was waiting for a reaction, maybe hoping I would start shouting so she could play the victim, or hoping I would get emotional so she could manipulate my grief. Instead, I reached down beside my chair and pulled up a thick manila folder I had been keeping ready on the floor. I didn't say a word. I just slid it across the mahogany coffee table toward her. It made a soft, sliding sound against the wood, a sound that, in the quiet room, felt as loud as a gunshot. I watched as she stopped pacing, her brow furrowing in confusion. She reached out, opened the folder, and began to read the first page. I watched the color drain from her face. It is funny how quickly the arrogance vanishes from a person's face when they realize they have been caught. She looked at me, then back at the papers, her hands starting to tremble slightly. She thought she was negotiating with a grieving, perhaps slightly senile old man who was too soft to protect his own property. She had no idea who she was actually dealing with. She didn't know that my life was defined by the pursuit of truth, buried deep beneath layers of lies and carefully constructed facades. Before I retired, I was a senior forensic auditor. For 30 years, I worked with the IRS, tracking white-collar criminals. My job wasn't just to look at spreadsheets. It was to look into the souls of men and women through the numbers they left behind. When a company executive embezzled millions, or a politician hid bribes in shell corporations, I was the one they called. I spent my career training my eyes to spot the smallest anomaly, a date that didn't align, an address that didn't match, a transaction that defied logic. I became a master at connecting the dots that people thought were invisible. My professional life taught me one fundamental truth that applies to everyone. People are terrible at lying. They might be able to craft a convincing story with their mouths, but they cannot stop their bank accounts, their credit reports, and their digital correspondence from telling the absolute, unvarnished truth. Money always leaves a trail, like a breadcrumb path leading straight to the forest of a person's true character. While other people look at a person and see their smile or their handshake, I look at them and see the balance sheet of their integrity. I don't seek revenge through shouting matches or public drama. I find that messy and inefficient. I seek it through documentation. I seek it through the slow, methodical assembly of facts that eventually form a picture so undeniable that the person on the other side has nowhere to hide. Brittany had spent the last 2 years playing the part of the dutiful, struggling young wife. She had convinced my son, Mark, that they were doing their best, that the world was stacked against them, and that they needed a lucky break. But I had been watching. I had been observing, auditing, and recording every move she made. And now, she had finally pushed me too far by targeting the one thing that was not for sale, the memory of my wife. She didn't know that by asking for that ring, she had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle I needed to dismantle her entire life. I sat back in my chair, took a sip of my coffee, and watched her eyes scan the pages of the file. The rain continued to drum against the glass, but inside the house, the atmosphere had shifted. The power dynamic had completely inverted in the span of 30 seconds. She had come here to demand an inheritance, and instead, she had opened the door to her own destruction. She wanted the ring, but after what was in that file, she wouldn't even be able to afford the gas to drive away from my driveway. I was calm, I was composed, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to see justice served on my own terms. To understand why Brittany was staring at that folder with such absolute terror, you have to understand the masterclass of a performance she had been putting on for years. She was a chameleon, changing her colors to suit whatever environment she was in. When she was around my son Mark, she was the picture of the devoted, struggling partner. She would sigh about the rising cost of groceries, complain about the interest rates on their modest car loan, and talk about how they were just trying to keep their heads above water. She had cultivated this aura of fragility, making Mark feel like he was the knight in shining armor who needed to work extra hours just to keep their domestic ship from sinking. Mark, bless his heart, is a good man, but he is a man who leads with his heart rather than his head. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that they were building a life together, brick by brick. Brittany knew this. She played on his protectiveness, his guilt, and his deep-seated desire to be a provider. She would leave fake overdue notices from utility companies on the kitchen counter, knowing exactly when Mark would walk through the door. She would sigh, rub her temples, and talk about the stress of making ends meet. It was a classic misdirection. While Mark was focused on paying the electricity bill she had already paid, she was busy orchestrating a much larger, much more dangerous game behind his back. I started to notice the cracks in the facade about 6 months ago. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. It was just a series of small, nagging inconsistencies that didn't add up. As a forensic auditor, my brain is hardwired to notice when the numbers don't balance. I remember sitting at their dining table for a Sunday dinner, watching her scroll through her phone. She would occasionally leave the room to take a work call, only to come back a few minutes later, looking slightly flushed. Then there were the emails. I have a habit of helping out with the household chores when I visit, and one day, while I was clearing the mail from the entryway, a piece of correspondence slipped out of a stack. It wasn't a bill, it was a digital receipt for an exclusive, high-end boutique in the city, the kind of place that doesn't sell groceries or utility services. The amount was significant, far more than a struggling couple should be spending on a whim. That was the first red flag, the first loose thread that I decided to pull. I didn't say anything to Mark. If you tell a man that the woman he loves is lying to him, he will usually choose to believe the woman. Instead, I started keeping a private log. I became a silent observer. I watched how Brittany's behavior shifted when she thought no one was looking. She became increasingly obsessed with my assets. She would casually bring up the topic of my late wife's jewelry, framing it as an investment opportunity. She talked about how it was a shame for such valuable pieces to sit in a safe, gathering dust, when they could be sold to secure their future. It was always about the future. The true turning point came when I found the Aspen rental receipt. It had been left on the counter, tucked inside a magazine. It was a booking confirmation for a luxury cabin during the ski season, costing thousands of dollars, an amount that was laughably out of touch with the financial hardship story she was peddling to Mark. That was when I knew. She wasn't just being greedy, she was being reckless. She was bleeding Mark's accounts dry, siphoning off money that they were supposedly saving for a mortgage, all to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford, and to build a safety net that excluded him. I realized then that the engagement ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry to her, it was the final piece of capital she needed. She wasn't asking for it to help their marriage. She was asking for it to fund her exit strategy. She had planned to take the money from the sale, dump Mark, and disappear before he even realized the bank accounts were empty. She was a predator, and she had mistaken my quiet, grieving persona for weakness. She thought she was the smartest person in the room because she was good at acting. She didn't realize that in my world, facts don't care about acting. Facts are cold, hard, and unforgiving. And I had spent the last few months gathering enough facts to fill a book. People often think that the hardest part of an investigation is finding the evidence. It's not. The hardest part is simply waiting for the subject to make the mistake that hands you that evidence on a silver platter. My career taught me that every criminal, no matter how clever they think they are, eventually gets tired. They get lazy. They assume that because they have gotten away with their deceptions for weeks or months, they will continue to get away with them forever. That is when they slip. That is when they leave the digital signature, the mismatched date, or the unexplained transaction that brings the entire house of cards crashing down. I had the perfect vantage point. Months ago, during a health scare that landed me in the hospital for a minor procedure, I had set up a power of attorney and shared access to the digital family accounts with my son, Mark. He wanted me to be able to step in if he was ever overwhelmed. It was an act of trust from him and an act of necessity for me. It gave me the keys to the kingdom. I didn't use them to spy. I used them to audit. I approached their household finances with the same cold, clinical detachment I once applied to multi-million-dollar corporate fraud cases. I didn't start by accusing anyone. I started by building a spreadsheet. I opened a clean, digital ledger and began to track every single inflow and outflow of cash for the last 12 months. I tracked the ACH transfers, the credit card payments, and the strange, recurring withdrawals that seemed to vanish into thin air. I spent my nights staring at the glow of my monitor, drinking coffee, and comparing lines of data. It was meditative. When you look at the raw numbers long enough, they begin to speak to you. They tell a story that is far more honest than anything a person can say. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. I found 3 distinct offshore accounts, registered to a shell entity that looked harmless on the surface, but was clearly designed to hide assets. Then, I found the gambling. It wasn't the casual, weekend kind of betting. It was systematic, high stakes, and compulsive. There were thousands of dollars in transfers to international gaming sites, all disguised as consulting fees or software subscriptions. Every time she told Mark that the money was going toward a new investment or a household repair, it was actually being funneled into these accounts to cover her losses. But the most damning discovery was the communication log. I had long-standing contacts from my years at the agency, private investigators who specialize in digital forensics. I didn't hire them to spy on her personal life. I hired them to do a deep dive into the metadata of the emails she had been sending from our home network. What they found was chilling. She had been consulting with a divorce attorney for nearly a year. I found the draft emails she had saved in a hidden folder, detailed lists of my son's assets, the value of the home, the appraisal value of my own personal accounts, and a roadmap for how she intended to liquidate everything before serving him papers. She wasn't just planning to leave him, she was planning to strip him bare. She was treating my son like a business to be liquidated and a target to be gutted. The ring, that emerald engagement ring, was not just a piece of jewelry to her. It was the final, portable asset she couldn't account for, the last piece of the puzzle she needed to steal before she could finalize her exit. I didn't feel rage when I saw this. Rage is a waste of energy. Instead, I felt a strange, detached sense of satisfaction. I had checked the math, I had verified the sources, and I had built the case. The numbers didn't lie. They never do. Every transfer was documented, every date was time-stamped, and every lie she had told Mark was now pinned to a reality she couldn't escape. I had the ledger, I had the evidence of the shell accounts, and I had the proof of her intent. I was ready to close the audit. I was ready to show her what happens when you try to gamble with a man who has spent his entire life calculating the odds. The dinner was supposed to be a standard affair, a family gathering meant to keep up appearances. The table was set with fine china, the roast was perfectly cooked, and the wine was breathing in the decanter, but the atmosphere was thick, charged with an invisible electricity that only I could feel. Brittany was playing her part perfectly. She was soft-spoken, doting on Mark, and occasionally offering those little, rehearsed smiles that she thought disarmed everyone. Mark was happy, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting across from a woman who had been systematically dismantling his future for the better part of a year. Brittany decided that this was the night to close the deal. She had spent months planting seeds about how they were struggling, how unexpected costs were mounting, and how my late wife's engagement ring, a piece of history she had no right to, would be the perfect lifeline to get them back on track. She leaned into the conversation, her voice dropping to a sympathetic, almost conspiratorial whisper, and brought up the subject again. She talked about the weight of the world on their shoulders, and how selling that ring would be an act of love, a way to build a foundation for their future. She was a brilliant actor. She looked at me with those wide, doe-like eyes, waiting for me to crumble under the pressure of family duty. Mark looked at me, his face hopeful, trusting his wife to be the moral compass of their marriage. He didn't know that the compass was broken. He didn't know that the woman he loved had been looking at his bank account like a hunter looks at a wounded deer. I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even put down my fork. I simply finished my bite, took a slow, deliberate sip of wine, and looked at her. The silence in the room stretched, becoming heavy and suffocating. Brittany stopped talking, her smile faltering as she realized I wasn't going to give her the emotional reaction she needed to win this argument. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and pulled up the manila folder. It was thick, heavy with the weight of cold, hard facts. I didn't say a word. I just slid it across the table. It brushed against the dinner plates, the sound of paper scraping against porcelain cutting through the silence like a knife. Brittany looked at it with a mix of confusion and irritation. She didn't want papers. She wanted compliance. She wanted me to just agree, to let her take the ring and walk away. But I insisted. I gestured for her to open it. She opened the folder, and her hands were steady at first. But as her eyes moved across the first page, a summary of the offshore accounts, the unauthorized transfers, and the gambling debts, her posture shifted. I watched, fascinated, as the confidence drained out of her. It wasn't a slow leak. It was an exit. Her skin went pale, her lips parted slightly, and her breathing became shallow and jagged. She flipped the page, finding the email logs, the proof of her consultations with divorce lawyers, and the detailed plans she had made to drain every cent of Mark's savings. The arrogance that had defined her for so long simply evaporated. In the space of a few seconds, she went from a predator playing a game to a trapped animal, realizing the cage had already been locked. She tried to say something, a pathetic, stammering defense, but no words came out. She just looked at the papers, then at me, and then back at the papers, as if hoping they would magically change their contents. Mark, confused by the sudden change in temperature, reached over and took the folder from her shaking hands. He read the first page, then the second. I watched his face undergo a transformation that was more painful to witness than Brittany's fear. He went from confusion to realization, and finally, to a cold, hard disgust. He looked at Brittany, not with the love of a husband, but with the shock of a stranger, realizing they had been living with a ghost. The silence in the room was now absolute. The struggling, loving wife was gone, replaced by the reality of a woman who had been planning to destroy everything we had built. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to make a scene. The documents did all the talking for me. I looked at Brittany, who was now staring down at her plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The power had shifted completely. She had come here to demand an inheritance, and instead, she had been presented with the evidence of her own undoing. She was no longer in control of the narrative. The numbers, the dates, and the signatures, those immutable truths, had taken over. And in that moment, she finally understood that she had not been negotiating with a senile old man. She had been negotiating with a man who had spent his entire life calculating the cost of a lie. The storm didn't come in the form of screaming matches, broken plates, or police sirens. In fact, the aftermath was startlingly quiet. It was the silence of a house settling after a massive earthquake, where you finally realize the foundation has shifted forever. After Mark processed what he was looking at, the printed records of his wife's betrayal, her secret offshore accounts, and the proof that she had been planning his financial ruin for months, he didn't look at her with hate. He looked at her with a profound, terrifying clarity. He simply stood up, walked over to the front door, and opened it. He didn't have to say a word. Brittany knew that the performance was over. She left with only what she had brought into the house, leaving behind the facade she had spent years building. She didn't try to argue, because there was nothing left to argue about. The numbers were irrefutable. In the days that followed, the legal machinery went to work. This wasn't about revenge in the sense of petty pranks. This was about justice. I had already prepared a comprehensive dossier for a trusted family attorney. We didn't need to hunt her down. We just needed to protect what was rightfully Mark's. When she tried to reach out, threatening legal action or playing the victim, she was met with a polite but firm cease and desist. It contained the attachments of her own financial discrepancies, a polite reminder that if she continued to push, the evidence would be forwarded directly to the financial authorities. She went quiet, and then she disappeared into the background, just another shadow, looking for a new target who might not be looking as closely as I was. Mark struggled, of course. It is not easy to accept that the person you opened your life to has been viewing you as a ledger entry to be exploited. He moved back into my home for a few months, a temporary arrangement that turned into a healing period. We didn't talk much about the betrayal. We didn't have to. We spent our evenings working on the house, fixing the things that had been neglected, and rebuilding the structure of his life. He started therapy, not because he was weak, but because he was smart enough to know that you cannot fix a broken spirit by ignoring the cracks. I watched him reclaim his identity, piece by piece. He stopped checking his bank account every 10 minutes with anxiety, and he stopped apologizing for his own success. He realized that his generosity had been a virtue, not a flaw, and that it was Brittany who had lacked the character to deserve it. As for the ring, it stayed exactly where it belonged. It remains in the safe, a silent, glittering reminder of a marriage that was built on truth and longevity. It will eventually go to someone who understands the weight of commitment, someone who values the history behind the object rather than its current market value. It was never about the emerald or the gold. It was about the principle of the thing. It was about protecting a legacy from a parasite that wanted to turn it into cash. And in that, I was successful. People often think that the quietest person in the room is the weakest. They mistake silence for hesitation and politeness for submission. They are wrong. The quietest person in the room is usually the one who has already checked the math, found the error, and is simply waiting for the perfect moment to present the final balance sheet. I learned long ago that most people live their lives on the surface. They focus on the drama, the noise, and the immediate emotional reaction. But reality is lived in the details. It is lived in the small, consistent actions that reveal who a person truly is when they think no one is watching. Greed has a peculiar smell. It smells like desperation wrapped in expensive perfume. It is a hungry animal that never gets full. And eventually, it forces the person to make a mistake. My life taught me that you cannot outrun the truth, no matter how fast you think you are moving. Eventually, the numbers catch up to you. Eventually, the trail you think you have covered perfectly leads someone right back to your doorstep. So here is the lesson that I hope you carry with you. Keep your heirlooms, hold your boundaries, and always, always trust the paper trail over the person. Words are cheap. They are easy to manufacture, easy to manipulate, and easy to discard when they are no longer convenient. But documentation, the cold, hard, time-stamped record of actions, is the only thing that truly matters. If someone in your life is making you question your sanity, or if you feel like you are being slowly drained of your resources, don't look for a fight. Look for the evidence. Be quiet, be observant, and be the one who does the math. Because when the time comes to balance the books, the person who has the facts will always have the final say. Justice is not about yelling the loudest. It is about proving the truth. And the truth, once it is finally laid out on the table, has a way of silencing everything else.